Yeah, we're here to be calm as we're counting up a few seconds. There's enough stress. How did you put it exactly, Adam? There's enough stress in the world without adding to
Yeah,
it. Something
there's
like that.
enough stress without having to add it to it yourself.
Yeah, we're here to relieve stress. When you're on the couch, you're letting that stress just fly away. Just you know, like it's gone off into the distance, like a balloon that you just let go. It's it's gone. So hopefully, more than ever, fantasy football can be like that for people. On that note, what is the number one mistake fantasy football players make that they're not even aware of? That and more this week on the couch. Adam Harstad. We're going through the looking glass into the mind of Adam Harstad. Adam, let's talk about our minds. What's the number one mistake fantasy players are making out there that they don't even realize they make?
I think it's probably overconfidence, but I'm not very sure about that.
Yeah, perfect. See, was that a wink there?
Yeah, you like that?
So, what's the prescription? Because I'm all about overconfidence, or I'm all about saying no, even in face of evidence that I'm wrong, I'm right because that one time that I actually was right, and that's what I remember.
I think it's a tricky one because I don't know that there is like an easy prescription. One thing I like to do when I'm managing my teams is I like to set up processes because a lot of times I know the right thing, but the right thing is hard. So I try to automate that as much as possible just so that I leave little room for my brain to get in the way and my pride and my ego to get in the way and say like, well, I mean, I know guys who start off slowly are probably undervalued, but this guy just looks really bad.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to get off of my shares of him. And so I like to have systems in place that prevent me from sabotaging my own success to whatever extent possible.
It's like you're managing yourself. It's like you're your own boss, and you put in safeguards so that you, the employee of you, don't override those things. But when we look at those trends, when we find those trends, and by the way, Adam Harstad, those of you that are old Chartpool guys, you know SSOG, and he is an OG when it comes to the meta understanding of how fantasy football being this exercise of letting all this football slant through our brain, process, and then make decisions and try to show we can make better decisions than other people, looking at our processes and really divorcing yourself. It's good, Adam, because you're kind of like a perfect counterbalance to me in the same way that Matt Waldman is at times, where I like to be emotional. I like to color outside the lines or spill all over the place. I think fantasy football is for doing that. The rest of our lives is where we have to really be staying true to most efficient processes. But at the same time, we all want to be better fantasy football players. That's why we're listening to the show. That's why we're subscribing to Football Guys. That's why we're part of this community. So, like you said, there are trends, there are general truisms, and when we try to talk ourselves out of a player being, in the cause and effect, like we identify the cause, but then we say, well, they're not going to be one that's subject to this effect. But should we, when we have these trends that we identify, have at least some working hypothesis for the why? And if we can say, well, this player doesn't actually fall into the group because they lack, it's the causality, right? Like we're always looking for the causality. The correlation's easy. The causality is a little more difficult. So are there times that it's actually the correct analysis to say, even though the numbers or data matches, this key missing premise or piece attribute is missing, so they don't really belong in this group?
Yeah, obviously there are times. One thing I would say is if you're the type of person who's inclined to do this, who's inclined to say, well, sure, the trends are this, but I think that this person's an outlier for this reason or another reason. I would really recommend taking notes, during the season about your thought process. And then I think this is one area where actually writing about fantasy football has been very helpful for my game. And then the next time you think that a player might be an outlier, go back and look at your previous notes about players who might be outliers. And first of all, you can see, you can diagnose mistakes in your reasoning from the past. But I think the bigger thing is just you realize how often you've been wrong on making that call. And that's, what I was saying about overconfidence being the mind killer. That gives you a little bit of perspective. And I'll tweet out from time to time. I've got a dynasty team, and it's one of those teams that, like, people are like, "Are you in a 2-team league, bro?" It's got like Mahomes and Barkley and McCaffrey and Michael Thomas and George Kittle, and I tweeted out, and people snarkily say, I would, must be nice having horrible owners in your league. And then I also like to tweet out just like a brief list of like all of the trades I've made over the year. Mm-hmm. And like just how many of them are just awful trades. I mean, last year, right before the season, I traded Chris Godwin for Sony Michel, and like, how good is that team? How much better would that team be if it still had Chris Godwin on it? And it's kind of fun, just as a fun exercise, but I think it's really useful as a reminder to me that, first of all, that, like, no matter how good I think I am, like, I make awful trades. I mean, I make like 30 to 40% of my trades wind up just being awful for me.
Like, I don't even want to admit on the air some of the trades that I've made right now.
Yeah, total cringe. But at the same time, I think it kind of emboldens me to make trades going forward, because I can be like, look, worst case scenario, this is going to be another Chris Godwin for Sony Michel. And I've made those trades in the past, and you can recover from them. That's kind of the nature of fantasy, is there's going to be some huge hits. There's going to be some huge misses. There's going to be times where you and your trade partner debate for, 3 hours, and you finally come up with a deal, and you're both really excited about it. And it turns out that everybody involved with the deal is terrible, and you never even remember it like 6 months later.
I also traded one of my Chris Godwin shares last year before the season. It was Chris Godwin, Hakeem Butler, Philip Lindsay, and a first for Odell Beckham. And I thought, I'm going to get Odell Beckham right before the solid blocker booster kicks in. Right. And maybe it'll be this year. So I've been there.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And it's funny too, how quickly we like to judge trades. Mm-hmm. I remember, I think 2015 or 2016, I traded Devontae Adams for Dion Lewis. And like 3 months later, I was feeling on top of the world about that one, because, Dion Lewis was tearing things up, and Devontae Adams was like one of the worst wide receivers in the NFL. And I was patting myself on the back a lot about that one.
One of the things I think on that note that happens a lot in fantasy football, even in the course of a year, sometimes even in the course of a game, we can be right and wrong.
Yeah.
Right. Things can happen exactly the way we expected for the reasons we thought they were going to happen. And then the anti-case, and this is where the lawyer in me comes out, that we can always make the pro and the con case for any player. And over the course, last year with Derrick Henry, well, I love Derrick Henry, but Marcus Mariota is going to keep anything from growing in the soil. It described what was happening with Derrick Henry, but then enter Ryan Tannehill, and all of a sudden, Derrick Henry becomes everything that we ever hoped he would be. So if you were fading Derrick Henry, you were right. But if you're saying, I'm going to keep Derrick Henry because he's so good that the water is going to find a crack and his talent's going to blossom, that was also correct. In general, see, one of the things, and this is such a wonderful, endless, when you put the two mirrors together and you just see to infinity, because what I always think about, it's funny, Adam, I think you and I think we both know that we have a lot in common that we probably have never even talked about, right? I've always been lucky, honestly, to be really good at standardized tests, and people would ask me advice, and I would say, well, when you read through the first time those multiple choice questions, one of them will have a little glimmer, a little shine, and then you'll start thinking about the answers, and you'll convince yourself of, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's this answer. Maybe it's this answer. And not only are you wasting time, because time can be an issue in standardized tests, but you're using your intellect against you. But at the same time, it's your intellect, your specific intellect, Adam, that is allowing you to identify these things. And as you said, create processes to try to filter them out. So, it's your intellect is your greatest enemy. What is it they say? Like your mind is a wonderful servant, but a terrible boss, or something like that. When we talk about mistakes you've learned from, what pops into your head other than the Chris Godwin trade, but more on the process level, something where you've tried to institute a firewall or a fail-safe to keep yourself from going back there. What's one of the biggest mistakes or biggest blind spots that you finally caught a glimpse of and tried to protect yourself from as a fantasy player?
I think the biggest thing is just, and this gets earlier, you said that we're very opposite in terms of process. And I think the biggest thing is just not falling in love with players.
But still loving the players, falling in love with them, but not when it comes time to make decisions in fantasy leagues.
Right. And again, you go back to that monster dynasty team I have. And generally, like, nobody's been on the team for more than 2 years because I'm just turning over everybody. People say, is this guy a buy or a sell? It depends on what you're getting. Everybody's a buy and everybody's a sell. And I've made exceptions. I absolutely fell in love with Rob Gronkowski, and I've had Gronk on all of my teams for forever. And I've probably made some suboptimal choices because of that. But honestly, fantasy football's a lot more fun with Gronk on my team.
Yes.
And it's supposed to be fun. So I'm okay with that. I'm okay giving up a little bit of value in that instance. But other than that, a lot of my processes, I joke, you've been around in fantasy for a long time. The old slam, like, do you even watch the games, bro? Yeah. And I joke, a lot of the stuff I could do without watching the games. I absolutely could. I put a lot of weight on average draft position in my drafts, and there's a lot of stuff I can do without watching the games. Now, I do watch the games because I like football. I'm not going to stop watching the games, but I think a lot of my biggest mistakes have been when I've been privileging, my eyes over my reason. And, I'm not Matt Waldman. I can't compete with Matt Waldman on even footing. So if I'm in a league with guys like Matt Waldman, I just need to find a different way to win.
Yeah, that's it's interesting to think about it as watch the game, enjoy the game, but that's not always the primary data that you're using when it's time to make a decision. Now, you brought up something really good, the idea that everyone's a buy and a sell, like even at this moment, like in this quantum kind of way, like depending on who's on the other side of the phone conversation, the player's a buy or a sell, or even the idea, and I think this is brilliant, that no player should be on your roster, with the exception of Rob Gronkowski or somebody that it's fun to have, because we're sharing, we want to be able to celebrate with them when they score. That's one of the things that fantasy football allows us to be part of the crowd of guys jumping on someone when they get into the end zone. But it is making trades, and this is a problem I've had in the past, right? Every offseason, there are trades that I want to make that I never find a way to consummate. That I ping people in the league, I make offers, I try to get something done, and then I come back and say, well, even if I would have taken a deal that was 80% of what I wanted, I still would feel like I was right now. And I didn't get a chance to put that inclination I had into action. And I remember, Adam, I think it was the first time you and I met in person.
I was just about to bring up that exact, I know exactly what you're going to say.
And this is an excellent, I brought this up earlier this week or recently on the show, that I think there's so much, even with fantasy football, we're kind of like a gold rush boom town now, the fantasy football media world. But even at this moment, there's still a lot of earth to be mined in the area of trades and getting trades done. It's probably the most underappreciated and least understood area of creating advantages, and not just the trades you should make, but what I'm getting at is to actually make the trades.
Yeah.
And the first time we met in person out at the Football Guys Retreat, 6, 7, 8 years ago, you had a little bag of candy for everybody in our Dynasty League football guys. And it was just this handshake, and it was a way of creating a good feeling, right? This is what we all should do as we go through life. It's easier to be nice, right? I mean, giving everybody a good feeling and associating you with a good feeling down the line can create good things. Is that one of the key parts? Like, it's one thing to know the right trade to make, but how do you get trades done?
Oh, you missed the other half of that story. I gave a bag, and in the bag was a bag of candy.
Yeah.
And 2 sets of rankings. One was your set of rankings. One was my set of rankings. And I had all of your players highlighted in one color and all of my players highlighted in another. And it was just me saying, like, look, here's my guys, here's your guys, here's what you think about him, here's what I think about him. Let's see if we can get something done. And with you in particular, you had I had RG3 and you had Russell Wilson, and you had Griffin rated higher than Wilson, and I had Wilson rated higher than Griffin. And I'm like, yeah, man, before we leave the retreat, we should just swap, Griffin and Wilson. It's win-win. And I got cold feet and I didn't pull the trigger. And so, I went down with the ship on RG3, and I think Wilson might even be the only quarterback on your roster still. You're still riding Wilson. So I don't know, like I don't want to present myself as the guy with all the answers, because I'm the guy, like I feel like I got as close, I took the horse all the way to water and I still couldn't drink there. So it's hard.
It's difficult because it's that. So, and then I want to go back to the idea of like getting trades done, because I think you probably will have some insight there since you're doing so many trades. So that's one of the things where it's unique whenever it's fantasy experts. I'm making air quotes. I have to make air quotes when I say fantasy expert every time. We have our rankings published. We put our thoughts out there. So it's easy to say, I remember Jeff Pasquino when I was in leagues with him. I used to do that. Like I looked at your rankings and my rankings, and it seems like if we both believe our rankings, then this is a deal that we should make. But to be fair, I say for anybody out there that's a fantasy writer or an aspiring fantasy writer, thank the people that ask you questions. Thank the people that ask you questions on Sunday mornings about start sits, or ask you, should I make this trade? Because it's one thing to do these exercises, create rankings. It's another thing when you actually have your team that you may realize, like, I believed this when I was emotionally distant from it, but now whenever I actually have to do it, and like you said, it might be wrong, but you go back and you're always stress testing your rankings. And I absolutely think that the moment of truth is really, it's clarifying in a way that's not always good, because again, from far away, you can feel like this is the right move. But then when you actually have to do it, like cold feet or otherwise, especially when it comes to buy low, sell high moments, that you tell yourself that, Christian McCaffrey, like this, or Lamar Jackson, right? Like the book says this is the right time to trade Lamar Jackson. This is the right time to trade Christian McCaffrey. This is the right time to trade Michael Thomas. But then when you actually get someone on the hook and you're reeling them in, all of a sudden the story that says, well, why are you trading away a player at the peak of their game, at the peak of their value, kicks in, and it can stop you. And sometimes it's not until after the moment of truth, when you set your lineup and the games kick off, oh boy, why did I do that? But before the moment of truth, you still have us all probabilities. And then when it actually starts to come down and become reality, I've made a huge mistake.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with the book there. I don't think it's time. I mean, especially in like dynasty leagues, I think succeeding in dynasty, if you have a guy on your team who's still producing 5 years from now, I think you've won. Mm-hmm. I think the best team 5 years from now is whoever has the most players today that will still be producing 5 years from now. So, yeah, I don't necessarily agree. But the other thing is, psychologists have done studies on something called loss aversion, which basically says that losses hurt more than, like, losses feel more bad than gains feel good. Mm-hmm. And they've actually quantified it. And they say that humans in general would rather avoid losing $1 than gain $2. Mm-hmm. So like losses hurt twice as bad as gains. And I think that makes it so hard to trade, because I mean, by that, your perceived gains have to be basically twice as big as your potential losses. And, nobody's going to make a lopsided trade like that with you, which is another reason I like going back over my old trades. And it's almost like, what's the word? The exposure therapy, like, okay, I might lose this, there might be like a 45% chance that I lose this. And if I lose it, it's going to hurt. But like, look, I've lost all of these other trades and I'm okay. Like it'll be okay. And even if it tanks my team, it's fantasy football. This is not, unless you're playing DFS for serious money, this is not, a matter of life and death for most of us. This is entertainment, or it should be. And fantasy can be entertaining even if you have the fourth best team instead of the best team. So I think sometimes I have to do that just to, get myself off of the ledge and just take that step forward, that leap of faith.
Hopefully, how I've always said fantasy football is therapy. And hopefully it is therapy, because when you're engaged with your teams, when you're managing your teams, all the other things that tear and scratch and claw at us every day fade away. And even if it ends up being, like you said, your team tanks because of it, there's an unburdening that comes when you're just in GM mode. And I always have a release of endorphins when I complete a trade. And I like it because it gives me a chance to test out, even if it's disastrous, it gives me a chance to test out something that I believed. But as a step back, because this is a very different episode of On the Couch, but in some ways the most appropriate episode of On the Couch ever, because we're talking more about that point where our minds are intersecting with this task, instead of that prism that this all passes through, instead of the light and the impressions that the light passing through the prism create that we act on. So for somebody listening right now, because we haven't got into, like, I like that you got into some good red meat fantasy analysis there. We said, no, it's not the time to trade Lamar Jackson and Christian McCaffrey and Michael Thomas in dynasty leagues. And I probably agree. That's why I characterize it as by the book. If somebody wants to get started, like, this is really interesting to me, but I've never really approached fantasy this way, to think about it as minds engaging with minds. And there's a lot of names we could drop right now in the fantasy industry that are doing all kinds of great work, or it's in their vocabulary to understand how this is these tendencies that human minds, including our own, have, and there are ways that you can take advantage of that, both by keeping yourself from falling into these traps and recognizing when other people are. Where's a good place to start for someone that's just beginning to look at fantasy or just life this way?
I mean, I think the best place to start is always with yourself, and it's always asking, what am I hoping to get out of this? What is this to me? And I think there's a lot of really good reasons to play fantasy football. It's a great way to keep in touch with people in your life. I think the longest relationships I've had in my life, other than people who are related by blood to me, it's people I've played fantasy football with for almost 2 decades now. And we've moved all over the country a bunch of times, and it's a way to keep in touch and keep track. For me, I like to say, and I've discovered over the years that I'm kind of a storyteller at heart. Mm-hmm. And I think that's my love of football too. I think football is a sport that has more of a narrative through line than something like baseball. I think baseball is more a series of disjointed, atomized events. You have a standalone at bat, and then it's followed by another standalone at bat, and there's no narrative through line between those. But football is all about the narrative through line, and you look what made football popular. The autumn wins a Raider and the immaculate reception, and it's the stories of the game. And for me, fantasy football is the same thing too. That at the end of the day, I care less. I mean, I want to win, but I care less about whether I win or lose than about whether I get a good story out of it, and whether, something memorable and meaningful arose out of this interaction. But there are other people. I mean, my wife is much more competitive, and she's not into fantasy football. But if she were to get into fantasy football, it would probably be to satisfy that competitive urge and to test yourself against, others in this arena. And, fantasy football, a lot of it is making hypotheses and coming up with beliefs. And then you get to test them against other people in an unbiased environment and see whose beliefs were best. And there's a lot of appeal to that. But I think everybody should know why they're playing fantasy football. And just in life, I think approach everything with a little bit more intentionality. But I think approach fantasy football with a bit more intentionality and decide what you want to get out of it. Because if you don't know that, how are you going to get it out of it?
Yeah, that's such a great... There's some of those questions are so simple that we don't ask ourselves, why am I doing this? And I'd love that you bring up storytelling. I don't know if somebody else came up with this or I came up with it. You should never give yourself nicknames, but I like to wear the Mayor of Narrative Street title with pride. But I think you're absolutely right to think of football as more narrative driven, or at the very least, your appreciation of football, or what makes watching football richer. Because one of the things I have always felt fantasy football does well especially get into IDP fantasy football and you start to learn the defensive side, or just the way that fantasy football gets you to drill down on coaches and coaches' previous relationships with players. The draft and following the draft does this, where you find out that, well, this team's position coach actually coached this player in college, and at the head, or Bill Belichick calls up Chip Kelly about Devin Asiasi or something like that, and you start to understand the way that these seemingly random crapshoot events at least have reasons, and they're continuing a story. And I think it was Russell Crowe. You remember, Adam, when Monday Night Football was having a different celebrity come on
Yeah.
during the third? I think it was Russell Crowe who said something like, every football player's life could be made into a movie. It's epic. Everything in football happens on this epic scale, and it's all of these intense emotional stories all intersecting in this moment. And then what happens, it's always revealing until the next chapter and the next chapter and the next chapter. And I definitely think that fantasy football allows you to understand more about the significance of every moment that happens when you watch a game, and it just makes it enriching. And I've always felt like football especially, but all sports are popular because it's, especially now, and maybe this is what people mean when they say we need sports now more than ever, is it's a way to get your emotions out that you can't get out in the course of everyday life. It's a way. I always cite that sporting events, one of the last places that public drunkenness is allowed, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's just understood that you're to let it all hang out,
Yeah.
And fantasy football allows you to do that too, in a way where you get really upset or really excited about how everything goes, but then you can turn the page and it doesn't actually matter. That's in a way that it can free you.
And I mean, you look at people naming their fantasy teams, what are they naming their fantasy teams? They're naming it after players. They're naming it after, how many fantasy teams were named after the butt fumble, or, it's even something like that. It's not, I have the best team. It's, I drafted this guy in the third round. So let's celebrate that. Let's celebrate, the choice I made there. And I think even then it's just an attempt to create a team identity. I mentioned earlier that Rob Gronkowski's like the one guy who I always want on my team. And we play in a dynasty league together. That's, there's tight end premium, and this is like tight end super premium. It's basically like 2.2 points per reception to tight ends. And he was my first pick in that league in the startup. And my team name is, if loving Rob is right, I don't want to be Gronkowski. Yeah. And, he retired last year, and I went through that serious debate that, like, do I change the team name? He's not, I don't think I ever cut him. I think I held him just in case. And, thank God I did. But I went through that whole debate with myself. Do I change the team name? And I decided, like, no, this is this team's identity. And for good or for bad, that's who it is. And it's again, it's about finding that narrative through line and celebrating it.
Yeah. Well, getting back to the genesis of fantasy football, it's like your own team that you manage. One of the things that I like doing more than anything in fantasy football, Adam, is whenever I have an open roster spot that I have to fill. And it's almost like holding tryouts, I just sift through the players, and there'll be 6 or 7 names, and then I'll drill down deeper and look more at their stats in certain situations, or go back and watch their college tape, or watch what they did last year in situations. And it's almost like I'm calling them into the office and saying, we're not, hopefully we can add you in the future, but this is not going to work out right now. And then finally, it's this momentous, when I add the player, like, that's who's going to get to be on my team, and so on. Or cut downs. Some of the leagues I have are going to have cut downs because they expand the rosters in the off season, and we're going to have cut downs coming on, and I'll agonize about it, and I'll really but it gets you back to that freeing idea of this little universe that you're in control, for better or for worse. And then something else you mentioned too is it keeps us in connection with each other. And again, now more than ever, whenever maybe more in-person interactions are limited for different reasons. This is a already very robust environment where we, as Twitter, and we interact with each other in this meaningful way, and it doesn't require that. And I think it does bring into the picture human connection, and even though it's winning fantasy football that is what we're chasing in front of us, the continued human connection and contact is what we actually get out of it. Now I was going to do this like a total right turn into hey, we have a fantasy football season coming up, but is there anything you want to add on this angle, like more your relationship with fantasy football as part of the foundation of your experience of it before we actually like talk fantasy football?
No, I mean, I think we're very simpatico on this. I mean, I've got a list of guys who I've added to my team 3 times or more. And they're the guys. Remember when the Denver Broncos kept cutting Chad Mustard and then adding him back, and then cutting Chad Mustard and then adding him back, and like I root for those guys. Darren Waller. I've had him on my teams. I don't know how many times. Off and on and off and on and off and on. Julius Thomas. I think I had 3 times. Dion Lewis. I was so excited when he finally broke out because he'd been on my team so many times, and it's silly like. The fact that Dion Lewis was cut from my fantasy team is not hardship for Dion Lewis.
No.
But it's so tempting to think like, oh man, he's been through so much. I hope he finally makes it this time.
No, totally. I'll do things like if my team's underperforming, I'll drop somebody that I probably shouldn't drop just to send a message to the rest of the team. The changes are coming unless we turn this thing around. You never thought he was going to be released, but now you're all in danger. So let's talk 2020 takes. I mean, just who's team Harstad this year? Who's some of your top targets or players that otherwise have stood out?
So part of my process, and I say that like a lot of the stuff that I do, I can do without actually watching any football, but I do watch football because I like it. But part of my process is I anchor a lot to average draft position because I think. And I've written about this that, if you're consistently drafting players who have fallen around from where they're usually going, you're basically getting free money. It's like you're getting extra draft picks. And I don't really have a lot of faith in my ability to, out project a David Dodds or a Bob Henry, or to out scout, a Matt Waldman or a Sigmund Bloom or a Cecil Lammey. Again, if I want to compete on a playing field with people who have very strong relative advantages over me, I think I've got to look for free money wherever I can find it. So I haven't actually done any drafts for this upcoming season yet, but I suspect that I'm going to wind up with a lot of the ugly players, the players who people don't really like, who wind up sliding for one reason or another. A lot of my dynasty teams, like I've got, like Ronald Jones for some reason. He's a guy that dynasty owners just don't like. He's 23 years old and he's ranked higher in redraft than in dynasty, which makes no sense because if he performs like he's ranked in redraft, he's going to be ranked a lot higher next year in dynasty. But, it's like those ugly players that I can get on the cheap and just kind of accumulate here and there. So I don't really know. I'm kind of curious to see how this year's drafts wind up playing out. And getting back to the first point about overconfidence, usually around this time of year, I have some guys who I think I'm going to have a lot of shares of. And then once the draft actually rolls around, like I get none of them. Or they're guys who I think I don't like at all, and I'll be on Twitter saying like, oh yeah, I don't like this guy at all. And then they just keep sliding. And so I wind up with a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot to sift through from what you said. Because I actually wrote something about ADP earlier this week. I do think you're right to put weight on ADP in a sense that it's just like the wisdom of the crowd rankings we just rolled out.
Right.
That if you can distill down some average take of a whole bunch of people who care about fantasy football, that's meaningful. Now, I've always argued that whether it's an auction and it's players that are cheaper than your projected value or ADP and a player that looks like a value, that if you make up a team of mostly that kind of player, then you're letting the rest of your league build your team for you. However,
I will caveat that I don't like ADP players at ADP.
Right.
I like ADP players after ADP.
Sure, no. But what I'm saying is, so what's interesting is ADP in and of itself is the stance of the hive mind about a player, approximately what they're worth compared to other players. And then, if we did 10 drafts with 10 different sets of people, different players would fall past their ADP, right? Because if a player was consistently falling past their ADP across drafts, then their ADP wouldn't be there. It'd be lower. If in every draft they're letting someone fall to the 7th round, the ADP says 5th round, the ADP is probably actually 7th round, and that's just a scenario that puts you in a loop that can't. So like in across 10 drafts, different players are going to fall. But I think that it's an interesting theory to test out that if you do in some ways, by letting the rest of the league pick your team, you're still doing yourself a service, because if everybody is, for the most part, it's meaningful, correct, then just taking those players will give you more values more often than not, because it's almost like the fantasy football players you're with are showing you their collective blind spot. If the larger group says this player's worth a 5th round pick, and then in the smaller group they're there in the 6th or 7th or 8th round, then if they're right, then that'll be a good thing. Go ahead.
Well, and I've the point I make is, so I'm not convinced that targeting ADP fallers is the best strategy, but it's the strategy I'm most convinced is a good strategy. Like, compare it to other strategies like zero RB or, robust RB or early round quarterback, late round quarterback, whatever. If you drafted 10,000 teams with zero RB, and you drafted 10,000 teams with, robust RB, and you drafted 10,000 teams, and on and on and on with all of these different strategies, and then you drafted 10,000 teams that were just composed of ADP fallers with, like maybe some rules, like don't draft 8 quarterbacks in the first 8 rounds.
Yeah.
At that point, they're not ADP fallers. You're just in a league that doesn't value quarterbacks. But you put on some basic, simple rules, and you draft 10,000 teams like that. And I guarantee you, across those 10,000 teams, you have a winning record. I guarantee it. Like, there's no doubt in my mind, because like you said, it's going to be different players in every league. So you're naturally diversifying your roster. If any player has a huge season, you've got exposure to them. Like every league winner you have somewhere on one of your rosters. But you got them cheaper than everybody else in every other league. So I don't know that that's the strategy that would produce the most champions, but that's the strategy I'm most confident would produce a winning record overall.
Well, you're winning at the margin. I mean, just because you're getting these, you're making your dollar stretch farther in drafts.
Like, imagine if you had Lamar Jackson last year, but cheaper.
Right. Well, and Lamar Jackson's the interesting counterpoint where you can say ADP's wrong. And I mean, I think that most of the people that were taking Lamar Jackson last year, hopefully, and there should be a handful of players for everybody that you're willing to take a round or two earlier than their ADP, because you just think that the hive mind is too pessimistic, or not optimistic enough about what Greg Roman's going to do and how good of a player Lamar Jackson is, or something like that. However, I think this concept is an excellent concept as a strategy, and as you said, you're gonna get wins at the margin. Something else that you have taught me about ADP, that, believe me, because one of the things that I hammer is, don't necessarily be one of the people that needs so much evidence to accept a new reality that by the time you accept it, you can't take advantage of it.
Right.
Sometimes overreacting to 1 week or overreacting to week 1 is what you need to do. But you have highlighted something that I always put on the other side of the scale so I don't run amok, as I want to do most times in September, that I always refer back to, which is through weeks 1, 2, 3. And this strangely maps up with Matt Waldman's idea that the week works in the season goes in these 4-week increments, right? And I think it is week 4, right? That no matter what happens through week 1, week 2, week 3, ADP is still more correct at predicting player outcomes on average than that early season data that we get. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So if you look at like the correlation between performance through week 1 and the end of the year, and you compare it to the correlation between ADP and the end of the year, like obviously ADP is better. Like there's a lot of 1 week flukes, right? And I think I don't think people will find that controversial. You know, what was that year? Frisman Jackson was like the number one wide receiver through 1 week. Nobody was valuing him as the number one wide receiver after that. They weren't even valuing him as a top 10 wide receiver after that, because people know, like, flukes happen. 1 week is 1 week. But every year I do it. I think I've done it 8 straight years now, and I go through and I quantify, like, where's the tipping point? Where does production to this point reach an equilibrium where it's telling us as much information as our preseason ADP? And I consistently find it to be week 4. Sometimes the first 4 weeks are slightly more predictive. Sometimes ADP is slightly more predictive, but that's about the break-even point, that the first 4 weeks of the season give us as much information as ADP. And obviously you can combine them, and that gives us even more information still. But it's interesting because there have been studies on, if you just drafted off of last year's stats, you know, you did some basic cleanup, like if a guy retired, don't draft him, whatever. But you do some very basic cleanup and you draft off of last year's stats. The equilibrium point on that is about week 3. So last year's stats are more predictive for this year's production or they're about as predictive for this year's production as the first 3 weeks of this season. So my joke is, like, everything we do all off season, you know, we spend 9 months, we do all these deep dives into all these players, and we do all this research, and we do all of our analysis, and we create ADP, and everything we do during the off season basically is just to buy us 1 more week until before we're wrong, you know, because without any of that, we can make it to week 3 and still be more predictive. And with all of that, we can make it to week 4 and still be more predictive. But by and large, people, I think, underrate just how predictive average draft position stays, and just how much of the first even quarter of the season is just a huge fluke.
Well, and some of that is, so a couple of things I want to say before I go forward and take this into the current moment is, so what I've been writing is looking at ADP last year and ADP this year, and then asking, well, what has changed?
Yeah.
And does it make sense, right? Like, does it make sense that AJ Green's ADP is about the same, even though last year he was already hurt when we were drafting him in the 6th round, and this year he's healthy, and so on. And I'm not saying I have a definitive answer, but I think looking at ADP, you know, some players' ADP has gone down, like, say, Tyler Boyd, even though you might say that they're better set up for success, or trying to discern what is the hive mind thinking to assign them there. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think I've been complimentary of ADP, but I don't want to sound like I'm a slave to it. And like I mentioned earlier with Ronald Jones, there's definitely some inherent biases in the fantasy football industry. And if you can be confident that you found one of those, then absolutely exploit that. Bringing it all back full circle, just the hard part is being confident in the first place, because, you know, everybody thinks they're smarter than ADP. Everybody who's reaching on a player thinks they're smarter than the ADP. And just mathematically, tautologically, more than half of them are wrong.
Right.
And so why do you think you're in the minority and not the majority? Because everybody thinks they're in the majority. That's why they're making that pick. And most people are wrong.
This is why statistically you shouldn't trade. The NFL team shouldn't trade up in the draft. And it is overconfidence, right? They're overpaying or otherwise believing that they're going to be right, and most of the time it doesn't work out. And the redraft higher than Dynasty ADP is, I don't know why that never even occurred to me. Like, there's a whole article or series of articles just identifying those players right now and saying why. Because in the case of Ronald Jones, even though he, with his age and where he's at on his career arc, should have a higher Dynasty ADP than redraft, there's something else at play there. Some pessimism that might be too harsh based on the opportunity he's going to get, because he has opportunity. It isn't just that he's on that part of his career arc, you know, whereas, say, maybe we don't know Darrell Henderson's opportunity. It seems pretty clear we know that Ronald Jones is going to have a chance to show the team that he deserves a lot of work this year. So that's just a ball that we can take and run with, of just identifying those players and then asking questions about, well, how did they get there and why? But I want to ask you this, because I think the whole idea that ADP is probably more correct than what we've seen through the first 3, 4 weeks of the season, it should cause a light bulb to go on for people. And I believe part of the reason that that's true is you hear it, the kind of moaning and groaning, like they didn't get to practice as much under the new CBA. Well, not the new CBA, but the last CBA. The teams are less prepared. The first week of the first month of the season is really the preseason. The preseason isn't even the preseason, right? You're familiar with all this stuff,
Oh
Adam,
yeah.
right? Like the veterans don't even play in the preseason anymore.
Right.
And it makes sense in some ways that like the real season starts around week 4, week 5, and that is when things start to adhere more to our expectations than those first 3, 4 weeks of the season where there's a lot more volatility. However, bringing it to the year 2020, without an off season, without anything resembling a normal camp, do you think that that date might get pushed back this year?
I don't know. I can see compelling arguments in either direction. Personally, I think the biggest driver is just, like NFL performance is not normally distributed. It's not a bell curve. It's not like if you graph all of a player's games, it's not like they're mostly clustered around some median, and then they have like a few outlier big games and a few outlier small games. It's called a power law distribution, which is like a ski slope. It just ramps down and goes off to the right. And what that means is that most NFL games are kind of okay, and then a couple NFL games are just massive. And in a large sample size, the massive games and the okay games kind of produce a stable average. But in a small sample size, like week 1 would be the famous example, the highest ranked guys in week 1 are the guys who had their massive game in week 1. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're more likely to have a massive one going forward. It's just they had it already. And then in a small sample size, week 2, the guys at the top are the guys who had their massive game already. At week 4, the guys at the top are the guys who had their massive game already. By week 16, the guys at the top are the guys who had the most massive games. Everybody's had their massive game by that point. But when the sample size is small, single outlier performances just have such a disproportionate effect. And I think that effect is still going to be here in the small year. In the weird COVID year, people are still going to have massive out of nowhere games. And the guys who have those games early are going to be showing up really high through 4 weeks. And it's not necessarily indicative of anything intrinsic to that player other than the fact that, random events are randomly distributed and they hit the jackpot already.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think the and or but is if we know something changed significantly about their circumstances, like they changed teams or there's a new offensive coordinator or something that can create a different trajectory this year than what we saw last year, we should at least be open to those first few weeks being the reveal of that and the means change and things like that. But we have to have a reason. It can't just be...
And I'd caution, I think we're really good at inventing reasons to support what we want to do anyway.
Well, yeah.
And so if we go into the season thinking like this is a very unstable situation, I'm going to react very quickly to what shows, I think that's a totally rational position to take. Like I don't know what this team is going to look like. Odell Beckham, like I don't think we really know what that offense is going to look like. I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. And it might make sense to react quickly if Odell Beckham looks especially good or especially bad. But I think the key is identifying that in advance, because if we're waiting until after it's already happened, we're going to find reasons to support doing what we want to do anyway.
Right. Yeah.
So it's is another nice thing about writing about football is it forces this accountability. Is we actually have this record of us believing things, and we can say, because we don't remember what we believe. Our memories are just so flawed. Hindsight bias and creeping determinism are just so strong. We always think we knew all along. And if we really knew all along, we wouldn't have acted the way we acted in the first place.
And I think there was just a study I saw in passing about like we can have nostalgia for things that didn't happen, which is maybe too close to home for certain things going on right now. But yes. And I think that there's always, again, if you thought that the Ravens offense was going to be just an entirely new massive offense and Lamar Jackson was going to lead the way, and then he goes out and has those 5 touchdown passes against Miami, And if you instead heard the people saying, but it was Miami, that could be a false positive.
And it could be, but
it could have been.
Everything's got to move your beliefs. Every piece of data should move your beliefs.
But on the other hand, if they are going to be a juggernaut offense, isn't that exactly what they should do against a team? This is the whole Tyler Higbee argument, as I see. Like, well, Tyler Higbee went off at the end of the year last year against this horribly weak schedule, but he was the #1 fantasy tight end during that time. Why should we ding him for doing exactly what a fantasy stud should do against an easy schedule? Anyway, that's a whole other. I mean, let me ask you that just quickly. Do you even look at schedule or strength of schedule, or is it one of those things that you feel like is too backwards looking to impact how we project this year?
Oh, so actually this, I used to be big on strength of schedule. And somebody a couple years back just hit me with a random tidbit on Twitter. And they said, fantasy players actually score more points on average in weeks where they're on your bench than they do in weeks where they're in your lineup. And I thought, that can't be right. There's no way that's right. Because like, think about streaming quarterbacks.
Right.
The whole idea is that you can start bad quarterbacks against bad defenses and get extra points out of it. And if streaming is a thing that like actually works, like, you should get more points on the weeks you start somebody than the weeks they're on your bench. And so, I'm like, that can't possibly be right. So I checked my leagues, just to, offhand quickly disprove it. And it's right. It's true. Every league I've checked it. And I've checked it a lot of times in a lot of different situations, expert leagues, casual leagues. And I've designed experiments to like replicate streaming. And I'm like, all right, here, guys, these are your available quarterbacks this week. Who do you pick? And I want to see if a group of experts who are doing nothing but trying to beat players' averages can actually beat players' averages. And consistently, no. Players score more points in weeks when they're not started than they score in weeks when they are started. And a lot of that is just because, somebody has a huge game, we start them the next week. So we already missed out on that huge game. But I think that has jaded me a little bit about the applicability of strength of schedule. I mean, I won't discount it out of hand. You look at Vegas projected point totals are a huge predictor of fantasy production across all positions. But I think I've become, today's theme is overconfidence. I've become a little bit less confident about my ability to identify like what is a good matchup, what is not a good matchup. Were those teams that Tyler Higbee went off against weak against tight end, or do they just look weak against tight end because Tyler Higbee went off against them?
Right.
Who knows? So I think my epistemic certainty in all of that has greatly decreased over the years.
This is why in DFS ownership percentages, projected ownership percentages, it's like almost like just knowing where the crowd's not going in and of itself, which kind of goes opposite of the point of ADP and drafting players going to fall past ADP, because that's kind of the crowd saying you should go there. But there's never a one size fits all solution. But certainly in DFS, I could see ways that this could be exploited. That matchup is overweighted. Not that it doesn't have any effect at all, but the effect is overestimated compared to the actual effect. We just got a couple of minutes left. Usually I go off the rails here, but just really quick on the idea of, Scott Barrett, our mutual friend, was on the show. He actually spurred me to have a show where we just talked about the effect of coronavirus, or at least what we think could be the effect. Do you think that fantasy players, sports bettors, should be creating a hypothesis and from the get-go trying to test that hypothesis, or prepare the way that you normally have, which it does seem like is based on Vegas lines and ADP, what is going on, and then only when we get a better idea of how coronavirus is affecting things, if it even is, then that's when you adjust?
So I try to intentionally, put Bayesian processes, and Bayesian inference is this idea that you start with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is as strong as the evidence that supports it. And then as new evidence comes in, you update that hypothesis. And how much you update it depends on how strong the new evidence is compared to how strong the old evidence is. So I absolutely think that everybody should have a hypothesis about how the season's going to play out. But something like coronavirus, there's just so much uncertainty surrounding it that I can't really imagine anybody has a strong hypothesis about how the season's going to play out. So I kind of think the best way to start is have an idea in your mind, but have it be a very nimble idea and react pretty strongly as new credible evidence comes in. So have a position, but be quick to update it.
Yeah, I think that uncertainty, there's a whole riff. We could probably do hours on this idea. I've been saying this once every other day or more, that this coronavirus time, it's like the uncertainty virus almost. It's just injected so much uncertainty where maybe we should have never had that certainty to begin with. And it's just pulled back the curtain that uncertainty was there all along, but the uncertainty is like the elephant in the room. One of the other things I know, something you and I have in common, something I think that, again, you may not know that I've learned a lot from you, is just self-care, managing your mental health. And I think that as we get further and further into this era of human history of our lives, that where managing, and fantasy football helps manage your mental health, self-care. I think all of us out there collectively can feel like the pressure, the stress building from the uncertainty and all these things. What can you offer just as what you've been doing maybe to practice self-care and manage your mental health through this time, or tips for other people? Because I know you've done a lot of reading and practice on this, and there are things that work.
Yeah. On the point of fantasy, I agree that fantasy can help manage self-care, but I think getting back, you need to be intentional about it. I have found over the years that if I'm in enough fantasy football leagues, it feels like work rather than release. Yeah. And so I've been very, very intentional over the years. At one point I was playing in 15, 16 fantasy football leagues, and I didn't like fantasy football anymore. And I find I can do 3, maybe 4 leagues. And after that, I just don't like fantasy football anymore. So, learning to say no, even to a good thing, something that you like, is very important. Setting reasonable limits and having those limits be based on, like actual, being honest with yourself. Like, I'm just not liking fantasy football right now. I'm going to step back a little bit. That's totally fine. We all have identities, but those identities aren't fixed, unchanging points. And we need to update our behaviors as we update our identities. And then mental health more broadly. So I've suffered from depression for a while. And the 2 things that I find, they're not silver bullets, but that help me manage it the most, is exercise. It does tremendous things for mental health. And there's a lot of science backing this up. And then the other thing is mindfulness meditation, which again gets back to, I think it helps me be more intentional in my life, and it helps me set clearer limits, and be more aware of the effects things are having on me. And those are 2 things that I always have to be on top of, because it's very easy to say I'm busy and I don't have time for it, but I live a happier and more fulfilled life when I'm keeping up with those. And then also another thing that's very scientifically proven is gratitude journaling. And that's every day you just think, these are 3 things that I'm grateful for, and you write them down somewhere. And it can be, like silly little things like, I had ice cream today and it was good. Mm-hmm. And they can be like massive things like, I'm grateful for most of human history, like 99% of people born in human history. Like, you can't walk out on the street and say whatever you want without facing serious state sanctioned consequences. And obviously in this moment, there's, I'm not going to say there's no state sanctioned consequences for anything, but, I try to be grateful for just the rights and freedoms that I have, that the majority of humans who have been born in this world, and even, who are born today, do not have access to. And I think being intentional and trying to think of, sometimes it's hard. I mean, it's silly to think like 3 good things didn't happen to me. Like 3 shouldn't be a hard number of things to be grateful for. But a lot of times it's hard because we get into these patterns of thought. And that's, I think, why gratitude journaling works, is it really focuses your attention on the good things in your life, because normally you're so prone to focusing on the bad things.
Yes. And I will say, I mean, especially as I've gotten older now, I'm realizing in hindsight how much depression and anxiety have skewed my story I tell myself about my life, and trying to isolate that lens and then affect it through things. I think exercise is excellent, gratitude is excellent. You may make fun of like Stuart Smalley and looking in the mirror, but something that I'm terrible at is thinking nice things about yourself, saying nice things to yourself about yourself. And it actually does change your way of thinking. Our brains are plastic, whatever the word you want to use, like pathways, and then they reinforce themselves and reinforce themselves and reinforce themselves. And then the way you change them is by thinking different thoughts. I mean, you can actually, as you keep bringing up the word intentionality, we can be intentional, and we can still, it's a hard balance, because I think this is a time also that the sadness of the world is so ever present. And in some ways it's callous to just completely think, well, I'm happy that I have running water, hot water, and I'm happy that I have air conditioning and things like this, because there is something important happening. But at the same time, it can, I think, for everybody, it can start to surround you and close in around you, especially with the nature of social media. Social media then creates this thing where we curate the voices that we hear and what they're saying, which then reinforces things that we were already thinking. And then we get back into that pattern. So being intentional and remembering you can change it. I think that's what's great when you bring up gratitude journaling, or just having these thoughts where you force yourself to say, I'm not just going to stay stuck in this. That's how you actually change it. And I think that things that you've shared, we've all shared behind the scenes, is something that has been important to me and helped me. And I think for all of us, I think fantasy football is full of people just think too much about everything. And this is a time where we have a lot of things going in that might be difficult to digest. We've already gone over the hour. And Cecil told me not to go over an hour, but that's okay. First, I want to say this is great, and it should have been a long time coming. I'm sure it won't be the last time, because people will say that I can have some calming influence. But truly, Adam, you're the calming, the placid, just like the sound machine, the waves. Anything else that you want to add at this moment to the people on the couch? Because I think that people are going to listen to this episode and say, this is causing the light bulb to go on for me, either personally or how I am as a fantasy player, or just thinking about my existence. Any parting shots?
I think, if I'm being honest with myself, I think the biggest thing I've done in my life to improve the quality of my life is just coming to the realization that I can be who I want to be and not who I think I'm supposed to be. Yeah. And it seems, like that's kindergarten, you can be whoever you want to be, whatever. But, like, I'm not to be immodest or anything, but like, I'm a really smart dude. I've had a lot of expectations on me throughout my whole life, like this guy's going to go on to be a millionaire entrepreneur or something, and I think I internalized those expectations, and I lived, I won't say, a miserable life, because it really wasn't, but just not a fulfilling and not a satisfying life. And then one day I realized, like, you know what? I get to, just because I have been given something doesn't mean I'm obligated to use it how other people want me to use it. And so, I was in a tremendously fortunate situation when my kids were born, that I was able to quit my job and stay at home with them. And, society, I don't think thinks very much of stay-at-home fathers in general, but it's been one of the happiest and most rewarding decisions I've made. But it was a very difficult one, because I had internalized so much about what I was supposed to be, and I felt like a failure doing that. And I think just over the years, getting to realize that, like, no, I get to decide, who I am, what I do, how I relate to that. Only I can decide, if I'm a failure. And obviously my wife, by marrying her, I give her input on the process too. But what makes life worth living is something we all get to decide for ourselves. And just getting back to intentionally, it's something that we should decide for ourselves.
Yeah, this is another thing I think where you and I share a lot, because I remember it was, I think, 11th grade. We had in my psychology class. We went around the class. We were talking about phobias. People said, "What's your greatest fear?" And people were talking about, spiders or drowning or whatever. And mine was not living up to people's expectations of
Yeah.
of my life. And I could echo a lot of the things that you say, and I'll bring up my father, Sigmund, another Sigmund Bloom, who you remember certain things that your parents teach you, speaking about parenting. And one of the things that he taught me was make your choices for yourself because you're the one that has to live with them. Don't make them for other people. They don't have to live with them.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean be selfish in the sense that you should only make choices based on how they affect you or whether you gain from them, because hopefully you still have an internal code that you need to adhere to. But there's wisdom there. And I think you're right that your valuations of things or being aware of how things make you feel, what makes your light glow brighter, is more important than how other people have defined that. And we're all wired differently, or we all have different destinies to fulfill. And whatever you're doing in any interaction or anything that you're creating, whether it's uplifting yourself and people around you, whether it's coming from a place of light, coming from a place of love, that's what's important. And we don't know the significance of our actions. Everything significant that has ever happened started with just one person in one moment. Everything, every great social movement started with one person saying, I'm going to draw a line here and say no. And then so we don't know the significance of what our actions are. We don't know what was important until, I mean, at least as far as, and that's the whole thing, right? Because what you're talking about is like, we have to have significance or relevance, right? Start a business that makes a certain amount of money, or have this many people know your name, or have books that are published or something like that. But everything is significant. Everything is relevant. And we've created this false framework that allows, like you said, other people's opinions to supersede what we know is best for us. I know, since I mentioned my dad, as I'm on the couch here, I'll mention my mom too. Real quick, because I can go on and on and on. She gave me this book, DOS Energy, that was like a 70s hippy dippy new age book. When she found out I was getting into fish when I came home from college for Thanksgiving, the first year I was in college, she's like, "Oh, you're becoming a hippie. I'm going to give you this book." But in the book, there was a lot of things I held on to because it stated things in a way that allowed me to carry them forward. And in the book, there was the idea that you are a machine that is perfectly tuned to detect what's good for you. Like you're a what's good for me detector. And we all have that in us, that inner voice in us, but we have to hear it over all the other voices that are coming in from the outside. And I think that's part of instituting that intentionality that you talk about, and just understanding what's good for you or what makes you feel fulfilled. So this is awesome. This, in some ways, Adam, is where I've always wanted the show to go, is going all the way back to how to help yourself and how to have a better life, or a better today, or better hour at least that you spend with us, because that's what life is made up of. So thank you, Adam, for making time for this. And Adam's at Football Guys, and you can find him on Twitter, Adam Harstad, if you are interested in more. Thank you, everybody, always for giving me this forum to have conversations like this with Adam and so many other smart people out there that have things to share with us. Camp is starting, football starting. We'll have more and more things to talk about, still spending time with each other as always. Thank you for giving us the privilege to serve at Football Guys. And as always, stay classy.